And just want to welcome John Ross to the group again, and we look forward and we can present to us, and the rest is yours, John. If you leave a wee bit of time to us, in case anyone.
Okay, no problem. Okay, thanks very much for having me back here again today after the last time. Hopefully I didn't bore you too much, and I'll not go on as long today, but what I'd like to do really is nearly get a bit of a conversation going at the end about the current situation here we have in Northern Ireland, and I'll draw some parallels to that. The gist of this really was about the Falklands, but I'll draw some parallels to it. 2 weeks ago I attended a lecture at Queen's University. I don't know why they invited me, but I went, and what it was, it's the 40th anniversary of the Falklands War, and the Falklands really have defined themselves from that point. So they had Falklands 40, and Falklands 40 really was showing how they had moved on since the war in 1982 and where they developed. And there's a lot of parallels. It's completely different from Northern Ireland in the overall context, in that their enemy isn't within the country, it's just away from them. But there are many, many parallels with Northern Ireland and where I believe that we're going wrong. First thing I'll say is a disclaimer. Anything I say are my own views, are not party political views or anything like that. They can be controversial, and some people find them controversial. I don't mind a bit of controversy. It doesn't bother me in the least. But I speak my mind and I speak it as I see it. So I'll just quickly go through some slides, and really it's a recap from when I was here before. And we'll talk about, I'll bring out some points as I quickly go through them that I think are pertinent to where we are today here in Northern Ireland. Right. So these were the things that influenced me back in 1969. Right? And I look back, as you get older you tend to look back, and you look at the things that influence you and how it affected you and how it drove where you are and where I've arrived to today. And the first one I put up Skinny Lizzie, and the reason I put up Skinny Lizzie, and many of us know Skinny Lizzie, she moved up the street. But Skinny Lizzie, everybody know who she is? Yeah. Lizzie Gilmore. Right? Lizzie Gilmore owned a wee shop, a wee parlour shop at the corner of Herbert Street and Chatham Street, it was. And she was the first person in 1969 when they started putting people out, for I suppose is the right term. Skinny Lizzie was put out in July. She always flew her flag, even though she lived in the Republican area. And she wasn't the only Protestant. There were 17 Protestant families lived in that area. And Lizzie always flew her flag, and there was always trouble. And she had a son, Geordie, big orange man, had a funny walk. And he used to, I think they called him Broken Arches Geordie or something like that. And
character, Geordie.
He was a character, true character, and feared nobody. And Lizzie's shop, you know, you often hear the excuse that people got arrested or they got shot when they were out for a pint of milk. But had they said they were going to Lizzie's shop, that was probably true, because you could have got a pint of milk any time of the day or night. She was always open. And she served that community over in Ardoyne. But it came then that Lizzie was being put out, was being burnt out. And there's always a bit of humour in Northern Ireland. When they were outside the door and Geordie was out confronting them and the flag was flying, she shouted up to the husband, Billy, you called him, didn't you? Billy Onion, he had a bit of a growth in his head. And she shouted up to Billy to get down quick, and she spoke, Bill, get down quick, here, Billy. And Billy's reply to her was, and this is witnessed, hang on till you get my teeth in. And Lizzie's response was that, oh, get down here, what are you going to do, eat them or bait them? And Billy got out. But as it transpired, they were put out and came across the road. There was then tit for tat, and there was a lot of Catholics put out around the Woodvale area, as we well know. And I remember I done the milk round, you know, we went to Wall Street, Palmer Street, the whole area. Done it with Billy Smith, the co-milkman, for many years. And I always remember there was 2 Catholic sisters who lived in Palmer Street. I think they were next door actually to John McVicker's house. 2 decent women, elderly women, yeah. And they were put out, and I can remember some of the neighbours actually protesting. It was wrong to be putting them out, but the response they got was that they needed the houses for the people in Ardoyne that were put out. And as it transpired, and why I'm raising the point of Skinny Dizzy, ethnic cleansing, you know, and you've got the build programme in the Shankill here, we see houses being built in Republican areas. You know, the last bricks hardly moved from a demolition before the foundations are going in stark contrast to Loyalist or Unionist areas. The 17 families that were moved out of Ardoyne at that time were all in rented accommodation. In contrast, the Catholics that were put out owned the houses around the Woodvale. They actually owned them. And a lot of them were bought through the chapel. And they had ways of meaning it. So I believe, you know, when you look back and look at them facts back from 1969, that the ethnic cleansing and taking over of areas was going long, long before we even twigged onto it. So the deployment of the army had a big influence on me. I can remember them coming up Disraeli Street. They got out of their vehicles down at the bottom of Enfield Street, came up, bayonets fixed. The army then were green combats and Second World War helmets, but it impressed me. I'd never seen a proper military rifle in my life. And they went up and they faced us down the Woodvale area. Patriotism influenced me in the early days. I was fiercely patriotic, always proud of my British identity, and still am to this day. And then the murders in the White Rock came in June 1970. And the Republican attacks in the Crumlin Road in August 69, I spoke about them the last time just very briefly. That was a day when Davy Linton was murdered. He was carried down the street and subsequently died. And Hugh McGalley, another man from Montreal Street, I kicked about with. Hugh was blinded that day. And that obviously, me as a 16-year-old back then, that influenced me and it influenced my thinking. It came, I was serving the time as an apprentice electrician in Durham Street. And back in them days, you know, kids from our areas didn't go to university or anything like that, getting a trade. That was the aim of the game. And the murders in the White Rock was another in the June 1970, and they happened on the Crumlin Road, East Belfast, and the bloke Reid, whose son was in the 20th Scouts from Broome Street, died a few weeks later. And Danny Loughlin's, I knew Danny, he was the only one that I actually knew, and Geordie, his brother. Danny was killed that day, and that was another thing that had a profound effect on me personally. Again, I just turned 17. Okay? And I had a feeling of hopelessness back then. You know, I thought, you know, where's it all going? No idea. And I wanted to do something, as most people did. We wanted to do something. And I went to the first meeting in the Leopold Street Pigeon Club of what later became the UDA, but it was actually the WDA, was the four founders. And again, you know, there's always a funny stories. There was a guy from up under us, I can't remember his name, but if anybody was at the meeting, they spread the word before they went in that they were going to need to get arms, ammunition, things like that. But in case there was somebody listening, they were still worried about touts, even in them days, or infiltrators. And they spread the word about the bandages, that bandages was a code word for munitions and all the rest. And they talked about raising funds and door-to-door collections. They hadn't progressed into extortion at that stage. And they mentioned bandages, and people were talking. And this old boy didn't get the word that bandages was a code word. And he expressed an opinion that he was getting a hell of a concern because we must be expecting a hell of a lot of casualties with all these bandages we were going to have. And again, that was a true story. So, decision time for me, I wanted to do something. And a lot of guys joined the UDA, a lot of my friends, a lot of them went to jail. Guys I still know today, and still respect in many ways, because they done things for the right reason back then. We had the vigilantes, you know, and there was no drugs, there was nothing like that. Or the UVF, and again, I know many people that went in UVF, many people whose lives were ruined, who would never have been criminals had it not been for the decisions they made and the circumstances they found themselves in at the time. Or the army. And I was still going from the Woodvale, walking every day down the Shankill Road, down Percy Street, down Divis Street, into Durham Street to Jennings Electric, where I worked. And even when the troubles went on, I went through the peace line, and I was impressed by the army, you know, I just was impressed. And then the parachute regiment arrived into Northern Ireland, And they were completely different. If people remember back then, they were the first people who came in with camouflage gear, different helmets, completely different. We played five-a-side football with them down at Sugarfield Street. Went to Ormo Park and played them with football, got a good tanking because they were so fit compared to us. And I decided at 17 and a half I wanted to join the army and went to York Street. I was a bit frightened to say that I wanted to go in the parachute regiment. I was 10 and a half stone wringing wet. And said to the guy, the recruiter, I want to join the army. You know, and got the usual answer they give you, you've come to the right place. And said I wanted to join the parachute regiment. He looked at me and he said, are you fit? Well, I was fit. I'd done a lot of cross-country running. I was in Dunkirk Nomads running at that time. And lo and behold, I'd done the various tests and all the rest of it. And that's what I subsequently joined. So in August 1970, okay, just 2 months after the White Rock, when I was feeling hopeless, didn't want to be there, wanted to do something, I went across the Aldershot and started parachute regiment training. And parachute regiment training for a young 17-year-old, I was the youngest in the intake, the only person from Northern Ireland who couldn't understand a word I said. I had to slow down, son, slow down, you know. But treated with great respect, even with the troubles that was going on. You know, you hear about bullying. I was treated with so much respect by these guys, because parachute regiment come from all over the country. They're not a county regiment, or they're not a local regiment. So there's Scotsmen, Welshmen, everybody. And from the very day I joined, and Margaret, my wife, she became an army wife for 20 years, we can say we never had a cross word said against us or anything, and still great respect for people. So went, and I've just shown some pictures here of P Company, the milling and whatnot. It was fairly aggressive, hard training for a young lad, 17 and a half. The average age in the platoon I went through with was 23 and a half. So we've got young lads. But it was aggressive. I loved it. Yeah, and I still say it was the best 6 months of my life doing things. It was hard and it was enduring. That was P Company, that was a test week. If you didn't pass P Company, you had to have a second choice, a regiment that you would go to. And a guy would be there one day and he'd fail something, he would fail the confidence, he couldn't, there's a lot more to the confidence course in the high bars. But he would fail that, and you'd wake up the next morning, he'd be gone. He'd be gone to his second regiment. And we started with 55 recruits, which was the normal intake at any one time. And at the end of the 6 months when we passed out, with 14 left, it was 14 of us actually passed out. And it culminated then in parachuting. The second time I went in an aircraft, I jumped out of it. And back in 1969-70, few people had been on an airplane. People here didn't go away on holidays the way they do nowadays. And air travel was a very rare thing for people. So it probably for the first 30, 40 times I went in an aircraft, I landed in it maybe 2 or 3 times because we kept parachuting. But I loved it. I actually loved the regiment so much I stayed there for 23 years. So quickly through the parachute regiment years, came straight to Northern Ireland, just turned 18, just scraped in. The 3 Scottish soldiers had been murdered around about that time, and all the guys under 18 were taken off the streets, put into palace barracks, weren't allowed to be on patrol. And I'll touch on that later as we go on and get to the Falklands. That was the Leeson Street riots. So I got here just in time. People maybe old enough can remember the days of rioting, and nowadays it's all corralling people and evidence gathering and lifting them 3 weeks later and all that sort of thing. We just get stuck in. There was no, you see guys there with no helmet on. That guy there is Sammy Copeland, who's actually just about to willy somebody with an FRG, the old rubber bullet gun as you may have called it. Sammy actually in later years, he was a hard boy, but Sammy in later years, around about 76 time, he'd left the army, went to Angola as a mercenary, and Sammy was executed then in Angola along with 3 other members of the parachute regiment. You tend to get guys in the regiment who've got an adventurous spirit. So I was 71 and I was 18-year-old and with good men. I was with good men. That photograph there, I'm not sure we showed that before, but that was in Cooper Street. That's Mrs. Henderson. And Mrs. Henderson's son lived in Disvella Street, and he had the paper round, and I think there's a lorry there that was adjusted better, just on the left-hand side. But that was Easter Tuesday, 1971. And that was me again in Cooper Street at the corner of Bombay Street, 18 years old, suddenly back. And I had a paper round, Virginia Dare, and I'd done the milk in the morning, the papers at night. And I'd done from Sugarfield Street down to Argyle Street. I found myself then in North Hart Street Mill, patrolling the area where I delivered papers. So I knew a lot of people. I knew an awful lot of people in the area. And yeah, standing there as an 18-year-old, it was good. It was good. I enjoyed every minute of it. And that's just explained what the two photographs are. So the 2nd of April 1982. By that stage, I'd obviously been in the army for 12 years. I was a platoon sergeant in 3 para, platoon sergeant 5 platoon 3 para. I'd been back to Northern Ireland, back to Ardoyne, South Armagh, Tyrone, West Belfast. We'd been back and forward to Northern Ireland. So at that stage, I was 29 years old, platoon sergeant, a fairly senior guy. The old man in the platoon is always a platoon sergeant.
Yeah,
at 29. And Friday the 2nd of April 1982, was an ordinary day, Argentina invaded the Falklands. And I don't know if people remember, most people didn't know where the Falklands were, I didn't. And we had no idea. And it was a Friday afternoon, the battalion was going on leave. I come home, we were living in Tidworth at the time, and I was going out to play snooker at the British Legion Club that night. We never reached the British Legion Club. As we were going, Land Rovers came into the estate and we had to go back to camp. This was on the night, that was the Evening Standard in London, that was the evening paper. And we were called back to camp right away that night. And we didn't know what was going on, but footage started coming through, and there was a small Royal Marine detachment down in the Falkland Islands, and some of them had moved to South Georgia, because in the weeks preceding the actual invasion, the Argentinians had given plenty of warning. They'd put scrap leaders onto South Georgia. Their intentions were well known, and the British government done nothing. They actually didn't react at all. And then when the invasion came in 1972, which was a fairly heavy invasion, they quickly overran the small Royal Marine detachment, who'd done a year tour. It had actually doubled because the relief had come in for the 1982-83 tour, so you had both detachments in the Falklands at that time. But no chance, they were quickly overpowered, and the governor at the time, Rex Hunt, ordered them to surrender. 3 para prepares to move. We started preparing to move that night. And Utrinki Paratus, the motto of the parachute regiment, what we lived by, ready for anything. And we certainly were. And we came back, and there was no mobile phones in them days. People didn't have phones at home, let alone a mobile phone. So to get the battalion back, and there's some good pictures, unfortunately I couldn't find one, but at all the railway stations in London where guys were passing through, they put chalkboards up, just chalkboard at the exit points, and it was 3 para Kandahar. That was the code word. If you got Kandahar, which was the barracks we were in, you knew to return to camp. So it was a matter of telegrams getting sent to guys' houses, local police going around and speaking to them, and the vast majority of the battalion were back in Kandahar barracks by Saturday morning. RCO.
And Margaret Thatcher called an emergency cabinet meeting on that Friday.
Yeah, she'd called, that's right. Yeah, she had. But 3 para, we actually weren't standby. We weren't the spearhead battalion. We were always on standby. A parachute battalion was always on standby. But it was, it was an immediate move. We weren't ready to go. So RCO at the time, Hugh Pike, Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Pike, who later became Lieutenant General Sir Hugh Pike, who was a GOC here in Northern Ireland, Hugh Pike sent a signal to the MOD in London and said 3 para were ready to move. This was on the Saturday morning after the Argentina invasion. There were spearhead battalions. It wasn't, but he was determined that we were going. But we weren't ready to move. It was a bit of a lie because our radios were incompatible with that of 3 Commando Brigade, who had already been ordered to move. We didn't have a NATO role, so we had what was called the Larkspur radios, which were older radios, and Klansman was taken over in the army at that stage. So we had no Klansman radio, so we couldn't have talked to anybody. And the reason for that and why we were low down in the priority list was because we didn't have a NATO role. We were always expecting to deploy on our own. Nor did we have any cold climate kit with just the bog standard, what we stood up in. We would never have survived in the South Atlantic winter. But fortunately for us and unfortunately for them, the Cheshires lived next door. And they were what was called the AMF Battalion, Ace Mobile Force, and their role was to protect NATO's flanks in the north and in the south. So these were guys who were trained in winter warfare. They ski troops and all the gear and whatnot. And on the Monday morning, we had a fleet of trucks went up and de-kitted them and took all their kit. You can imagine how them guys felt. They had trained, they were prepared. This was their sort of war, but it was outside NATO, and we were taking their kit off them on the Monday. And the kit then was getting handed straight out to 3-para. We started training on the radios, their radios, and worked all week preparing to move. And as it turned out then, 1 week later, the following Friday, we were moving out. We were down at Southampton. Margaret was there with the 2 kids waving bye-bye in tears from the dockside. We were on the Canberra, the band was playing, and we were sailing out of Southampton just 1 week later. On Canberra, I'd seen it being launched in 1962. Never thought I was going to go cruising on it 20 years later. And what a way to go to war. What a way to go to war. Because the crew all stayed on. And we had all the perks, and most of the perks, of the actual cruise. And during the week, Canberra was, to commandeer a ship, they've got to put men on it. Some old laws. So one of our colour sergeants went with Marines, and they flew to Gibraltar, and Gibraltar was in the Canberra was at Gibraltar on a cruise, and they went aboard Canberra, and Canberra was commandeered and brought back to Southampton. People were short cruised, if you like, and they then started building helidecks and welding helidecks and everything else in Canberra. It was turned into a troop carrier, but a fairly luxury troop carrier. So life on board, sailing south, we trained. There's a helicopter behind, a Sea King helicopter behind, and I wouldn't say we had a good time, but it wasn't hardship. It wasn't hardship. And round the deck of the Canberra was a furlong. Okay, I know it's low enough for them. Maybe gambling men, 8 furlongs to a mile. So 8 times round the deck was a mile, and we had to book it. So the Canberra was troops running around the Canberra, carrying kit around the Canberra, literally 24 hours a day. It never stopped. As soon as one finished, the next one came in, and it just went on and on and on. And we've done a lot of training up in the decks. And this picture, this little guy, he came from Newton Ards, Northern Ulsterman. And about him, there was, we did have Ulstermen in the parachute regiment in 3-para. And when I arrived in North Hard Street Mill, Sammy, who was quite unique, he was a boxer. He boxed for Ireland before he joined the army. And then when he was in the parachute regiment, he boxed for England. So he had 2 international vests, fantastic boxer, hard wee man, and fit. You never met a fitter man than it. And I was having a cup of tea one night in North Hard Street, just weeks or days after we arrived, and they came in. They were a patrol company. The patrol company patrolled around Belfast. They were all older blokes. We were a rifle company. And he heard me speaking, and he said, "Where are you from, son?" I thought he was picked off with Shankill Road the day before. I said, "Belfast." And he just looked at me and said, "Are you fit?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "You better be. Us Ulstermen have got a good reputation in this battalion." And I was looking at this guy, who was years older than me. They'd been to Radfan, they'd been to Aden, they were all experienced soldiers. We actually had Second World War veterans in the battalion at that time. Bear in mind, it was only 26 years after the Second World War. So these guys were hard boys. They were hard boys. He became a great friend. He became a great friend over the years. And sadly, no longer with us, passed away just over a year ago. And the other guy was my best friend, Catholic from Glasgow, big Celtic supporter. And yeah, opposites attract. But he was my best friend all the way through, way after I joined the army. Sadly, we buried him 2 years ago. And the guy then, Johnny Weeks, he was my company sergeant major, got the nickname the Rock of Mount Longdon. He held things together. Again, an older bloke, hard boy, and he's still a great friend of ours to this day. So, as we sailed south, we stopped at We stopped at Sierra Leone for one night, and they took on water and they took on board. Canberra could produce water, but it obviously had freshwater tanks. And that was at Sierra. We moved on then to Ascension Island. Ascension Island is a volcanic island. There's not much to look at. There's beautiful beaches and there's clear water right in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and a British dependency. But the Americans are on it because it's got a runway that could land a space shuttle. So it was actually the emergency landing place for the American shuttle, or future shuttles. And there was a lot of cross-decking then. You can see a helicopter. It's using landing craft, using helicopters, because ships were quickly loaded at Southampton. There was no time. It was just get the kit on and get on them. So we spent time at Ascension Island while all this was happening. We believed at that point, right up to right up until about a week after this, that we would turn around and come home. There was a lot of diplomacy going on, a lot of stuff going on. We honestly never believed we were going to war. But while we were at Southampton, UK imposed a 200-mile exclusion zone around Falklands. It became a big thing, this 200-mile exclusion zone. And within 2 days of it, the General Belgrano, which was the biggest ship in the Argentine Navy, sailed into the exclusion zone. Unbeknown to them, Britain had by that time moved a nuclear submarine down in the area, HMS Conqueror. And Belgrano, and it became very controversial because Belgrano was actually sailing out of the 200-mile exclusion zone, heading back to Argentina when the decision was made to sink it, and it was sunk with well over 200 men killed on it, Second World War stuff. I've no mixed feelings about it. That ship was a threat. It was a threat to future things. I'm a soldier, I was a military man, sinking it was right. But it became very controversial because it was actually sailing out and wasn't posing an immediate threat at that time, which began to play a big part in my life, particularly in this place, about immediate threat. So Belgrano was sunk, and within 2 days of Belgrano being sunk, HMS Sheffield was hit. And Sheffield didn't sink immediately, it sank afterwards. And we bombed Stanley Airfield with a Vulcan bomber that flew from Ascension Island. So the war was getting pretty real at that point, and we were still at Ascension Island. We knew then that we were going to war. And the whole attitude then changed on the boat. We started taking things a bit more serious than what we had been taking because we were sunbathing on Ascension. It was beautiful. And we sailed down into the South Atlantic. And down into the South Atlantic, completely different. It was rough seas, grey, wet, cold. And we were on these boats. When you went up on deck in the Canberra, you looked around, you had the escort ships. You could see the aircraft carriers. We were part of a group going in. And on the 19th of May, it was, they got a bit windy. They got a bit windy on the boat. That you had 2 commandos, we would call it a battalion, but 2 commandos, 40 and 42 commando, on the Canberra along with 3 para. Had Canberra been hit, had it been hit, the war was over. That was the nucleus of the fighting force. 3 battalions, brigade strength on that ship. So the order came down as we were preparing battle. We were priming grenades, we were cleaning kit, and all the normal things you would do into battle. It came down that 3 para was to cross deck, and we had to do that within about an hour. And we were cross-decking onto Intrepid. And Intrepid was a commando carrier. It was an assault ship. To get out of the Canberra on the landing craft, there was only one door you could do it by, and that was through the gasher in the galley. So one man at a time could get out of that door and into a landing craft. The seas were rough, and you were waiting for the wave to bring the landing craft off before you stepped off. And you'd have full kit. You'd have about 100 pounds of kit on your back. There's no other way of doing it. So it was but we managed it. It took hours. It took hours in that afternoon. And as we filled the landing craft, then we went. And Intrepid could open the back and flood the decks, and the landing craft could just drive straight into it. And as we drove into the landing craft that day, D Squadron 22 SAS had been down before us. D Squadron was predominantly, I mean, SAS was about 86% parachute regiment at that point. D Squadron was predominantly parachute regiment. And D Squadron were on the boat, so they were sitting waiting for us as we came in to the deck. And of course, there was a lot of handshaking and all the rest of it, because we all knew each other and served with each other. Later that night, after we got the whole battalion on board, and some guys were having a beer, sitting talking and all the rest of it, and the alarm went off on Intrepid. And that was the night, the very night, we were just on board when the Sea King helicopter bringing SAS blokes back who had been on doing some covert missions on West Falkland crashed. It crashed not far off Intrepid. 20 men on board, no survivors. And we knew a lot of the guys that were on it. So again, the mood changed. The mood changed. And we were preparing. The Navy had give up their beds, and we had guys sleeping in beds. We were sleeping in corridors. They're not the most comfortable shit. And coming off Canberra to go onto that wasn't the best. But they done their best. And it was 2 nights later. We spent two nights on Intrepid. We were ready then to go ashore. The landings were like the Second World War, you know, at a smaller scale. We were getting into landing craft and going in. We were paratroopers, we weren't Marines, but we'd done landing craft drills on Ascension Island. And, you know, typical, there's not a lot of love lost between Parachute Regiment and Royal Marines. Wasn't all happy clapping on board the Canberra, I can assure you, with separate bars, and guys were really kept apart. And rivalry, people would call it friendly rivalry. It went a wee bit beyond that at times. But when, you know, we would take the mickey out of them when we got off the landing craft in Ascension Island and said, is that it? Are we Marines now? Is that what you do? So we got on board anyway, and we went ashore. And again, it was surreal, because there we were heading ashore. We didn't know whether it was going to be an opposed landing. We knew there was Argentinians in the area. The Navy ships were firing us in, so the naval gunfire was coming over, and we were getting in, we were going to war. And as I say, 2 days after, and that was the anti-tank platoon of 3 para coming on board. The kit that the guys carrying there is a Milan anti-tank missile. And that was support company 3 para. Our role in life was to operate alone, behind enemy lines or whatever. So our support company were good. They were our only supporting weapons we had of indirect and direct fire. So we had anti-tanks, we've got Milan, we've got Wombats we never deployed in the Falklands because the ground was too soft. Our mortars were the best. Between us and 2 para, there was always an argument who had the best mortar platoon in the British Army. But that was our indirect fire support. And it was what we needed, because we were always expected to operate alone. So the Falkland Islands in 1982, St. Carlos, where we landed, was up in here. And the decision to land there was because they said that the Argentinian aircraft, because of the high ground around it, couldn't attack us. Well, that wasn't quite true. And they did attack us, and Canberra was sitting as a target in the middle. And there was 4 ships. Ardoyne was hit 2 days after we landed, and it was surreal because we'd occupied the high ground around Stanley, and we fired everything at the Argentinian aircraft, the Skyhawks, as they came down the side to attack the ships. And it was relentless. They were just coming in wave after wave. And they were trying to take out the ships, and Argonaut got a direct hit and exploded, and we sat in the hill and we watched it explode, and it's a real surreal and an emotional thing when you see a Navy ship sink. As the bow just went up in the air and it went beneath the waves. They hit 3 other ships, 3 LSLs, and they hadn't got the timing right on their 500-pound bombs, and the bombs went straight through the ship, but they corrected that later. And Canberra then, it was realised, wouldn't have survived, so Canberra was pulled out at night and went and anchored way off South Georgia, out of range of Argentine aircraft. While we're on the map, we were here, and me see if I can make that a wee bit smaller because we can. This is a piece. It's a wee bit better. While we were dug in up on the hills, waiting to see what the order of the move was, we were aware that Atlantic Conveyor was on the way. Atlantic Conveyor had 4 Chinooks on board, 6 Wessex helicopters and a couple of Lynx. And that was the capability we needed to move forward rapidly. Fortunately for us, and unfortunately for the task force, Atlantic Conveyor got hit. It had 8 Harriers on board as well, but the Harriers had managed to were ready off and it deployed onto the aircraft carriers. An Atlantic Conveyor got hit and subsequently sunk a couple of days later under tow when they were trying to tow it in. So one Chinook had managed to get off, and that was the only heavy lift helicopter that we had on the islands along with it. So the capability to move forward rapidly had gone. It wasn't going to happen. And you can imagine up at the high levels, we were the grunts down in the ground. You can imagine the thought process, what were they going to do? And we needed a victory. Britain needed a victory. So we were here in Port St. Carlos, and you had 2 and 3 para, fairly close together. And the decision was made that we would start walking. So we loaded up with kit, and Margaret Thatcher wanted a victory. And Darwin Goose Green, which is down in this area here, that well over 1,000 Argentinians there. They knew it was a garrison, they had aircraft there and all the rest of it. So 2 para were tasked to take out the Argentinians at Goose Green. Great decision, 600 men in a parachute battalion fighting troops. And they were tasked to go. 3 para, we were tasked to leave and start walking across to the F here, which is Teal Inlet, via Douglas Settlement, which was up here. So we'd done a big loop up and round. It was about just under 40 miles all together. We had full scales of ammunition, so we couldn't afford to take the luxuries, we couldn't carry it, with sleeping bags and all that. So we basically moved in fighting order, in heavy fighting order, and started walking. And the plan then was that our kit would catch us up every first or second day when we got it. It worked out. It was on average about every second day while we walked across. So we always had at least one night with no kit, no sleeping bags, no nothing. And to walk across that terrain and the weather, there was rain, there was hail, there was snow. It wasn't the most pleasant, but that was our bread and butter. That's what we trained for. Long tabs, heavy carries was a parachute regiment way of life. So we've done it. 2 para subsequently attacked Goose Green, Darwin and Goose Green, and they took it. They took 1,100 prisoners at Darwin and Goose Green, and they lost 18 men. And we got it on the radio at night when we were sitting there, because we had HF radio comms, and we got the news through that their CO had been killed, H. Jones, and there was a few rumours came about. But strange in the thinking of a soldier, when you get setbacks like that, it increases your determination, it increases your resolve. So heads didn't drop or anything like that. We were going to win this war. So we got to Teal Inlet, and our objective ultimately was Mount Longdon. And Mount Longdon is the top arrow, the most northerly triangle on that map. The Argentinians had always assumed that Britain would attack from the north, that we would come in, shortest route down into Stanley. It made sense in some ways, the Germans said it in the Second World War, you couldn't fathom British thinking at times. So we went to the furthest point and came ashore, thinking we would have helicopters to move forward. Didn't have the helicopters. Argentinians knew, it was well documented, well covered, that we lost the airlift. They would never, or didn't expect us to walk right across the island. The only one commando unit and 3 power were the only units that actually walked the whole way and tabbed the whole way. And if helicopters had turned up to pick us up at Teal Inlet, I'm convinced Hugh Pike would have sent them away. He was determined that we were going to walk the whole way, which we did, we duly did. So we went to Teal Inlet, small settlement up here there. And our next objective then was Estancia House, just down here. And that's where we started. We went to the hills to Estancia House. It was only a farm complex, battalion headquarters was there in it, and we were on the high ground round it, preparing for war, preparing for battle. So the long tab, the challenges on the long tab, these are what they call stone runs. I think they're a glacial feature or something like that causes them. But they were a few kilometres long and maybe in some places 200-300 yards wide. So you can imagine coming across that at night. You know, when you're carrying 100 pounds of kit, you're tired, you know, you're not in the best of form, and you've got to stumble across them. And we've got a lot of guys who've got injuries and sprained ankles and all the rest of it. We dreaded coming to these, but there was a lot of them about in the terrain. And there was no option, you had to cross them. The same with the rivers. When you came to the rivers, boggy ground, you were walking through it. It was maybe up to your knee. When you got to the river, you had to wade the river up to your waist and get across. There was no option. There was no boats. There was no way of doing it. And this was in the middle of winter, when you had no kit, you had no clean socks, and you had to then try and keep warm at night. So the stone runs, as we said, were a problem. Rivers and bogs. The weather was severe, and the lack of cover, because you're always conscious. There was no cover, there's no trees in the Falklands.
Oh my
yeah. So the Argentinians, we relied on the CAP patrols of the Navy, the combat air patrols, that they would pick up the Argentinians, which they did most of the time, as they left Argentina, and they would intercept them. And you could see Harriers actually sitting behind hills, hovering behind hills, waiting for Argentinians to come in. And the advantage that they had was that the Argentinians had little time over target, minutes over target. By the time they had come from Argentina and they had to get back, they didn't have a lot of time over target, whereas the Harriers had more time because they had come from the ships. So they had the big advantage, and would often get the Argentinians as they were trying to get out. The Argentinians had to get out and to get back. They wouldn't have the fuel. So we had a lack of cover, which was always on your mind. It was always on your mind that, you know, aircraft. We'd seen the aircraft, we'd seen the capability when we were at St. Carlos. We knew what they were capable of. So when we moved, we were spread out, to avoid heavy casualties had we come under air attack. We got to Teal Inlet, and Teal Inlet, we took Teal Inlet fairly quick. There was a handful of Argentinians there that we captured with no resistance. And that's me there. And people have often said, why there was never a film made. Well, you can see now, you know, Burt Reynolds, where was he? So, it's worse.
You haven't changed much, sure you haven't changed much.
So, this little lad lived in a house, and the mother, she washed her socks and everything else, and the kid called us up, and we managed to get a good night's sleep. The reason I put the picture up, as we come on, this was a young platoon commander we had. Young platoon commanders who's been in the army, you look after them. Don't make many decisions. Platoon sergeant makes decisions. And the guy, this guy here, Brian Eaton, married to a Belfast girl, Scouse McLaughlin, who I will talk about later. They were corporals in mine. I had one other corporal down the barn. Days, weeks after this photograph, just over a week after this photograph was taken, Stuart was killed on Mount Longdon, and Brian lost a leg. Brian was badly wounded. In fact, I had 3 corporals, plus I got an extra one from anti-tanks, and I lost all 4 of them. 3 badly wounded, 1 killed. And when we attacked Mount Longdon, that's 33 men. It was a boosted up platoon to give you extra firepower. And by the next morning, I had 14 left. And of the 14, I had one NCO. All the NCOs who were leading their men all got taken out during the battle. And the little lad there at the front, Gavin, the family had come from England and they went to the Falklands because they were into nature and they were into the bird watching and all that sort of thing. Gavin was 11-year-old, and I've said it often when I've done things, he had a mental age of 33. Yeah. It was a nightmare. And he sadly died 7 years after that at the age of 18. He was killed in a house fire.
Oh, no.
So it's a poignant photo when I look at it because of losing Scouse and Graham losing the leg. The days before the battle, we were up in the hills around the high ground around the Estancia House. Battalion headquarters were based down at the house, and we went down for one night to Estancia House to give the platoons from up in the hills a bit of a break and give them a central scoff. We didn't want to do it, and patrol company were conducting close target recce on the known objective, Mount Longdon, including getting a route for us to go and mount the attack. So these guys were out every night, or actually on Mount Longdon. Good lads. And we didn't, Parachute Regiment is completely self-sufficient. We didn't have SAS thing that we wouldn't use then. We had our own patrol company who'd done that. And flying across, there was a Murrell River was blocking us, between us and Mount Longdon. And it was a fairly deep river. And we knew, put down there, the river was a priority, flank crossing point was a priority, as we knew the existing bridge was recorded as a target for Argentine indirect fire. 4 platoon, Ian Mackay, BC, was a platoon sergeant of 4 platoons. They sent the platoon's fighting strength patrol out. And as they approached the bridge at the Murrell River, they came under sustained indirect fire. And anybody, again, who's been in the army, you silently record targets as you go along, what we would call X-rays. So we would have X-ray 1-2, X-ray 1-3, and if we got into trouble, we would simply, knowing where we were, call fire down in X-ray 1-2. We'd pre-record it with the indirect fire guys where it was. So the interesting thing, just cover that first. The Argentines, we knew they had minefields. We knew there was minefields covering the approaches, and patrols actually dug one out and brought it back. And the battalion, they carried the mine back to show, what they had and what we knew. So we knew there was extensive minefields, and not like minefields you can see in Second World War, like Ardoyne and Skull and Crossbones. They didn't mark them; they weren't marked at all. So we knew when we went that we were going to have to go through minefields. There was no choice. But when we said go down to Estancia House, Ian Mackay went down before me. He was 4 platoon, I was 5 platoon, and had a nightmare because you had the QM there, you had the RSM and all the rest of it. We were happy up in the hills. And as I was heading down, Ian was heading up, and he said, "Ah, John, turn around and go back." He said, "Nightmare down there, they're useless, annoying you." And when you got what was called air raid warning red, it came out through the whole Falklands. It was because the Navy radar had picked up Argentine planes on the way.
Oh, no.
So nobody knew where they were, so it went to air raid warning red. We ignored it up in the hills. There was nothing you could do. So if you're in your sleeping bag, you pull the zip up another notch. Nothing you could do. When they got down to Estancia House, you had quartermasters and whatnot there. And when they got air warning red, they were running like, getting everybody down into this river bank. And when Ian was down with 4 platoon, Ian done what we done in the hills. He ignored it, and he ended up getting shouted at by the QM. And the night before, they had been on the patrol, they'd come under fire at the Murrell Ridge. And the QM shouted at Ian because he was showing no urgency to get his blokes down into cover. "Have you ever been under fire?" And Ian was a sarcastic enough bloke. Ian said, "Yeah, last night." And carried on. So Ian said to me, "Don't go down." So we went down. It was a bit of a nightmare, but we stayed there. And then the following morning, the lady in the farm had made bread. Looked beautiful fresh bread. and let it out. The CO and whatnot were going to dine in this bread. They were being well looked after. And somebody stole the bread. Somebody stole the bread. And I was summoned and questioned on the bread. And the RSM was a bloke called Laurie Ashbridge, still in Knob to this day. And I said, I don't know nothing about your bread. And I didn't. I was being truthful. I knew nothing about their bread. And the world had come to an end. These 2 big rows of farmhouse bread had been stolen. So we were heading back up the hill. I'd forgot about it. And Scouse, the guy who was killed, came up and he said, "John, I've got the bread." So we dined on the bread when we got to the top of the hill. There was no way I was going back. So on the 11th of June, 3 prepared to mount the attack in Mount Longdon. And it was all the normal stuff in battle. We tested weapons, we checked fire, we reprimed grenades, made sure the detonators were proper, we white phosphorus with it, we had everything. And our mission was across the start line, 8 miles away at midnight. So we left just at last light to start this 8-mile walk to the start line. To get across the river, we didn't want to wade the river and then go into an attack. The river was waist deep. And we had a squadron of engineers, 9 squadron parachute engineers. They came with us and they knocked up a makeshift bridge up between ladders and planks that 1 man at a time could get across. And they got the bridge across the river, and the whole battalion crossed that one bridge, which took longer than expected. So we were late to get to the start line where we were going to start at midnight. And I said there, not that we were in any great hurry to get to the start line. We'd all talked, shook hands before we left. I think I read the poem the last time here. The Sergeant Major, the big guy showed you, Johnny Weeks, had been up and down the line. What he'd said was, "Pray to your God if you've got one." We knew when we went in that we all wouldn't come out. So that was the inevitability. And when the start line, we got to the start line, and everything's drills, everything's training, everything's drills. And we got silent, there's no need to shout our orders like that. We fixed bayonets. And we had the bayonets fixed, and we crossed the start line. And as we crossed the start line, if you read the bottom, the battle erupts. It was B Company, and I was B Company, and lucky enough, privileged enough, was a point platoon in B Company, an honour I was so grateful to get. You'll be the front platoon, you'll be the forward platoon get in. And as we crossed the thing, and we knew we were going through a minefield, if you read that photograph actually appeared afterwards from the military library. As B Company advanced towards their objective, fly half, Corporal Brian Mills steps in an anti-personnel mine. The explosion alerts the Argentine soldiers, and Longdon explodes in a blizzard of tracer. That image was taken from the left of 4 platoon's forward left section. Now, if you look at that and know anything about tracer, with us, we had tracer loaded magazines 1 and 4. 1 line was tracer, next 4 were ball. So if you consider what you see there, that there's another 4 in the air for every line that is going in. And the large flash coming across, and I'll talk about that later, that was actually a Milan missile fired by our own blokes, the anti-tank platoon. And if anybody remembers the poem I read, it gets a bit emotional for me at times reading it, because I think about things. But one of the lines, I put it down the bottom, "Then leading his men, one triggered a mine, a dastardly weapon of dread. All hell was let loose, the air filled with noise, as tracer turned their night sky red. As a curtain of death rained down from the slopes, there was no hesitation or fear. They would not be denied, they'd take no backward step, drive on, their mission was clear." And that, I wrote that verse in that poem, and that was obviously the inspiration. When we seen the tracer coming down and being moved in, and at that stage I was round about this area here, ready to go up and assault the hill. It's an unnatural thing to want to go into that, but the training we've done so much live fire in the parachute regiment with overhead fire and all the rest of it. You're actually trained in these sort of situations. The amount of lead coming back at you wasn't there, and that was just the subtle difference with it. But we carried on and we got on to Mount Longdon. And we got amongst the Argentines. There's very few pictures of the actual battle during the battle, as you can well understand. There's no time for people to take snaps. But again, that is at the front. That's another verse of the poem I wrote. I'm trying to put into words what it was all about. And it was confusion, chaos, and the putrid stench of war quickly pervaded that hill. The enemy in front, long prepared and dug in, would prove to be hard to kill. But kill them they must, there was no other way. No white flag would be shown that night. And as their own fell amongst them, every man there was prepared to the end of fight. And the fight, it was hard. You can see little bits of it, how big the rocks were, and there was rock runs. The Argentines had been there for weeks, so they knew the area. They were dug in. They positioned their weapons well. They had 50 caliber machine guns, 7.62 machine guns, 105mm anti-tank guns, anti-aircraft weapons in direct fire roll, 120mm mortar, which was heavier than anything we had. And they threw everything at us. They threw everything at us on the battle. And it was close, intimate fighting. You know, you were coming into the rocklands. It wasn't a nice big long fields of fire or anything like that. It was actually getting into the Argentine bunkers and trenches. Again, which we were trained for, bunker busting. You know, where 4 men in a half section would start the attack this bunker. You had to get into it. You know, you could fire at it all day when men are inside a bunker. So you had to get close to it, and you've got to get 2 men up, one right on top of it, one to put the grenade in, one to come in right behind that grenade. As soon as it explodes, you go in, and anything in front of you gets killed. And it's vicious, and it's hard. And that was the nature of the fighting on Longdon that night. And it went on for hours. And B Company, who we were the point company on it, we took the brunt of it. We took the brunt of the fight as we moved forward. And my job at that point is trying to keep the momentum going, trying to coordinate the sections and all the rest of it, and fight yourself. So it was a long, hard battle that the British hadn't fought since World War II. The cost of that battle, we lost 23 men that night. We'd over 50 wounded, and I'm talking badly wounded, lost legs, lost limbs, something like that. The Argentinians had 44 killed. So in that, you know, relatively short battle, there was nearly 70 men killed. And that's the 3 para guys that we lost that night. And just tell you a little bit about some of them. Sergeant Ian Mackay, VC. Ian was actually killed in the first half hour of the battle. Momentum, he was a platoon sergeant trying to get momentum going. They'd come up against bunkers in front of them, and Ian made the decision. He was killed, so I can't really give you what his thought process was at that point. But Ian made the decision that he would attack the bunker himself. And he took a couple of young lads with him, and they were killed. We had 3 17-year-olds killed from the company that night. And when you think that in Northern Ireland we took 17-year-olds off the street, I was 17 when I joined, and you know, were they too young to die? Do people here think they were too young to go and fight?
Yes, they were.
Again, as I've done with many things, many things, I went through a stage in my life where I wrote a lot of poems. I'm not a poet, I suppose, you know, clearly demonstrate. But I wrote a poem about our young soldiers, and when you look at them, this guy here, Neil Gross, I watched him taking his last breaths. It was his birthday. The young lad here, Jason Bird, the only Jew that was killed during the war. Lovely guy, lovely family. We got to know his family over the years. They're buried in Aldershot Military Cemetery, in what was the biggest military funeral since the Second World War. And there were other 17-year-olds and 18-year-olds. But they're the guys that's at the front of the fighting. And I wrote a poem, and really it was for Neil Gross's mother, who regularly goes to the graveyard and the graves. We were there only a short time ago. They're immaculately looked after. But I called it Our Young Soldiers, and I'll just read it if I can. Old soldiers never die. I wish that was true. But sadly, so do young ones. Just remember 82. At 17, too young to drink, too young to cast a vote. But they all went south with heads held high upon that great white boat. Young men, aye, they surely were. Some said too young to fight, but they were paratroopers, and they believed they'd earned that right. And just before the battle raged on that mountain far away, it was not said, but thought by all, would we see another day. They shall grow not old, the saying goes. I wish that was not true. For they were young, too young to die. I believe, I truly do. To their loved ones they were children. Their hearts were filled with pride. Just months before, when they passed out to the march, when the Valkyries ride. Valkyries is Ride the Valkyries is parachute regimental march. These guys hadn't long finished their training. With heavy heart and sorrow, we led them all to rest. They were the cream of Britain's youth. We only took the best. And if a choice we gave them to stay back home or fight, I have no doubt the answer, for they were brave men that dark night. Their families, and I met many of their families in the months and years afterwards, and they still, as I say, go to Overshot Military Cemetery, where a lot of the guys are buried. And you know, when you look back, I tend to get emotional looking back. Not that I'm suffering from any sort of PTSD or anything. You know, you knew the guys. They were friends. And I keep losing my... This guy up in the corner, Ginger McCarthy, I'll show you where he was. He was one of the anti-tank guys that fired that missile in. And this guy down the bottom, Scott Wilson. Scott Wilson was a corporal with 9 parachute Squadron Royal Engineers. Guys who built the bridge, who were with his assault engineers. They were brothers-in-law. They were married to sisters. So on that night, 2 sisters, both lost their husbands. So it was a heavy cost. Yeah? And yeah, as I put there, another 2 lines from the poem I wrote. 23 brave men died with many more men on that hill in a far off land, and the battalion chefs recovered them all on stretchers with care in hand. Our normal stretcher bearers trained with a band. We didn't take the band with them. We said there was no room on the boat, so they didn't go. So the battalion chefs, our cooks, they became the stretcher bearers, and they were magnificent, and they recovered every wounded man, and tremendous bravery they showed. So 40 years on, now where are we? 40 years on. The passion that drove me then never went away. And I found myself fighting really, and a lot of these photographs here are with what's been going on in Northern Ireland and veteran persecutions, and coming from the parachute regiment, we suffered the brunt of them. And I've been in fall. I think the top one there is in London. That was outside the BBC. Great speech I made that day off the top of my head. The Bogside Trust. Bogside Trust attacked me in every newspaper. When Maria, she's one of the things. So I wasn't really bothered about it. But Gavin Robinson, listening intently to what I had to say, but he didn't do it more often. And again, that's Margaret beside me. She's always beside me when we were in London. Northern Ireland Crown Force Veterans for Justice. Dennis Hutchings, who became a great friend. Dennis died of COVID last year. That's Jim Alistair came down to the court to see him. That's the Warren Point Memorial. Danny Kinnan, the Veterans Minister, and again speaking at the City Hall as I've done so often. So I found myself not wanting to, getting involved. You know, you retired and had a good job. I worked hard. I managed DHL Express International in Northern Ireland for the best part of 25 years. So I had a busy job, but lucky enough I worked for a company who understood me, or tolerated me, one or the other. And they knew there was nothing underhand. I couldn't hide what I was doing, and I wouldn't hide what I was doing. I would have left work first. So I got all the support in the world from the company for what I was doing and the fight. And the feelings I had of hopelessness back in 1969, they were still there, and they're still there when it comes to veterans. This legacy issue that they're bringing out is a shameful piece of legislation. It's shameful. People say it's only been brought out to protect soldiers. Well, at the end of the day, it's given an amnesty to terrorists. And there are terrorists still on the run today who can't come to Northern Ireland. They only get 2 years if they're caught, but they don't come. They will be lauded as heroes. They'll be on platforms at Easter rallies and all the rest of it as heroes for the crimes that they committed, and with total impunity, because nothing was going to happen to them. So that feeling of hopelessness in dealing with the veteran issues.
Sarah,
No,
I wanted to ask you, see that wee fella that showed you all the time his face was disfigured with the fire?
yeah,
Was
Simon
he one of
Weston.
your ones?
No, he's a Welsh guard.
I was wondering, because he's been interviewed a lot of times.
Yeah, he's a Welsh guard.
Yeah.
And got his injuries through negligence,
Yeah.
really. They should never have been on that boat. They should have been taken off it. And they were left on it. But,
Sitting ducks.
sorry?
They were sitting ducks.
They were sitting ducks. And when I said, I would speak later, that was one of the things I was going to say, the Argentines, they were on an LSL, one of the LSLs that had been hit in St. Carlos water when the Argentines hadn't perfected the fuses on the bombs. When it came to Fitzroy Cove, where the Welsh Guards were taken out, they had perfected the bombs, and the 2 LSLs were hit. So then, again, I didn't really want to, I have no great aspirations to be a politician, I can assure you of that. But what was going on in this country, and people may disagree with me, and that's certainly their prerogative, but the only man that I thought was doing anything for us and saying anything for us, in fact, was Jim Alister. And I ended up sharing a platform with him up in Crippen Street, Orange Hall, wasn't it? And got to know him a bit, you know, and he's a great man. You know, and he's not, unless you know him, he's not like the grumpy old man you see on TV. And in fact, we were at a TUV function, and he went to some house and the woman didn't recognise him. And she said she was voting for the grumpy old man. And Jim said, I'll live with that. I'll live with that. But, you know, I ended up sharing platforms on different things. And I think that was in East Belfast, which was difficult for me because we'd agreed beforehand that we wouldn't, it wasn't party political, it wasn't electioneer or anything like that. As long as people tell the truth. As long as people tell the truth. But by the time I get up to speak, and I don't write speeches, you know, everything comes from the top of the head. Don't remember it, but I don't like standing there reading a script. So I stood up and I hadn't a clue what I was going to say, because what I'd intended to say after I'd listened to what other people had said, I couldn't bring myself to say it because I'd listened to lies. I'd listened to lies and denial. And said what I said. And, you know, there are many things. I'm not going to start talking about the protocol now. I could talk all night on it. But if people would just admit the mistakes that were made by unionism in the lead up to the protocol and in the years before, would be in a better place for the forge unionist unity. But they deny the mistakes made, and they didn't do this, and they didn't do that, and they didn't do it. And my fear, I ended up standing as a candidate, knowing that we wouldn't have the likelihood of ever getting in. In fact, it was the only reason she let me stand.
As if I could stop you.
But we achieved 66,000 first preference votes, which has certainly put the pressure on the DUP. How long that lasts, who knows? But I've still got a feeling of hopelessness today that we're losing. And when I stood on that platform and other platforms and listened to people on other platforms, the protocol must go. That was all I heard. Protocol must go in its entirety. Watch carefully what Jeffrey's saying now. Protocol must be replaced. Replaced with what? Doug Beattie, we need a landing zone. The only landing zone we need for the protocol is a crash landing. It needs to go. And I worked for 25 years in DHL. I sat in the committee of DHL, the Brexit committee, with particular interest in Northern Ireland. And we produced 5 scenarios of what the protocol would bring. And we're in the grace periods. We have not seen the protocol. People need to realise that. And of that 5 scenarios, we got the worst one that DHL produced. This is commercial people. Politicians make decisions. Business implements their decisions. They have no idea how to, implement what the protocol says. And if we get these green and red lanes, nothing has changed, and people will not see it until it goes. So I hope. I've still got that feeling of hopelessness. I hope that I'm proven wrong. I hope the DUP stays strong. I hope we get rid of the protocol. But I think I might be back here speaking to you in 6 months and saying what it all went wrong. So the Falkland Islands, really where I wanted to get to, 40 years on, and we've gone wrong. We were often asked, right, since the end of the Falklands War, nothing has changed from the Argentine perspective. They still lay claim to this day to the Falkland Islands. As veterans, we were often asked, were the sacrifices of 1982 worth it? And although the losses stayed then and remain painful today, we always answered yes, in the hope that our brothers didn't die in vain. And that goes for Northern Ireland, it goes everywhere where soldiers are deployed. You always hope that it was for something, that you didn't die in vain. And again, just go back to the poem I wrote. This was the last verse of it. So I think we asked ourselves the question. Their thoughts now turn to brothers lost who paid the ultimate price. To those are they broken on a hospital ship. Was it worth the sacrifice? But they were soldiers, they were the best, and right they all believed. And in Stanley Cathedral, as a padre preached, to a man they quietly grieved. And we had done our job. As the army, we move on to the next job. We'd done our job. But that question, did they die in vain? And the Falkland Islands, I wouldn't say backward, that would be a wrong term, but it wasn't an organised place. They were farmers, they were local people, fiercely British. And we often wondered and worried, what would happen to them? Was it only a matter of time before Britain betrayed them and before they were handed over? And it looked like that many times. And the Argentines, if I went back to the first photograph of the 2nd of April of the Evening Standard, it mentioned oil. Oil was the rich. In the Argentines, we knew there was oil in the area. And as I say, the current estimates are 8.3 billion barrels in the seas of Scotland, and 14 billion remaining in the North Sea. I'm not an economist in that sort of thing, but I think it's substantial oil, and there's 5 companies actually involved in it. To date, they haven't took a barrel of oil out of it, because the Falkland Islanders control that now. And we'll see it as we go along. The Argentines developed a strategic narrative, something unionism needs to learn from. We have no strategic narrative. And where I draw parallels is Sinn Féin, we hear it all the time, they're way ahead of us in their strategy, way ahead of us in this. Well, they are. And their strategic narrative covers the past, present and future. And I spoke to a guy at this lecture I went to who is one of the world's leading experts in developing strategic narratives and how they work. And if you think back just a few weeks ago, Michelle O'Neill said there was no alternative. There was no alternative to their terrorist campaign. And got the usual token response from unionists. Yeah, there was no alternative. When really it was a calculated statement, very calculated. Their whole philosophy, it's built in strategy, it's built in fabrication and revisionism. None of it's true. But they portray themselves in the eyes of the world as an oppressed people. As an oppressed people who were under attack by the British state forces and Protestant oppressors. That's what they present. So when they say they had no alternative, with that scenario, they were forced to fight. They were forced to fight to defend themselves. So they're not shooting themselves in the foot when they come out with these things. It's all part of the strategic narrative. And people, doesn't fool us. It fools some people within unionism, but it doesn't fool the vast majority. They don't care about us. Worrying about fooling us. They don't give two hoots about fooling us. But it fools people in America. It fools the young people throughout Ireland. And that's a symptom of where they're succeeding with their strategy, that they've done the right thing, that they've no alternative but to fight. So Argentines done a similar thing. And these signs, Las Malvinas, Son Argentinas, they're all over Argentina. They never stop lengthening. They're at every motorway. The Malvinas belongs to Argentina. That bottom picture there, in 2012, they stopped all British ships, all British registered ships, got into any port in Argentina. And really, again, that was strategic because the oil industry moved a lot of heavy equipment and all the rest of it. Argentina's the nearest ports. It was being used. They had to stop that. They had to go to Chile. And it was all part of their strategy to undermine the Falkland Islands. And in 30 years after, around 2012, right, they had three interconnected strategies as it was called. Now, if you look at the top of these posts are all made from Royal Holloway University, who are the world's leaders in strategic thinking. And they pursued three interconnected strategies: active disruption to Falklands life and British assets. I think Sinn Féin do pretty well at that. They do pretty well. Co-option of regional neighbours. Again, Sinn Féin, it's exactly what they do. And promotion of sovereignty claims at national and international scale. Who do we have represented as in the international? Gerry Adams can go to New York and fill a hotel at $5,000, whatever it is, a head for people to listen to, because they've got that. And if I use the example of they have no alternative but to fight, where they glorify, eulogise their terrorists, treat them as heroes, they fought for them, they've done this. I think back to 1969, and when we came under attack up in the Woodvale area, there was no police. The police were stretched. You know, there was an armoured car going from Divis Street up to the Crumlin Road and away again. And it was local men, good men, I could name them, you could name them, who organised the defence of the Woodvale at that time, good men. Some of them went on and were convicted of things, maybe what they shouldn't have done. I wish they'd all joined the UDR and wish they'd mimicked what happened in 1912. Our people joined there, but they didn't. They went on. But there's no recognition for what they'd done in 1969. There's no recognition for the men who went out and stood in the streets where there was no police or anything like that. They're largely disowned by political unions. Largely disowned. So we fail to deal with the past. We fail to challenge the Republican narrative with the truth. And the Republican narrative, I put it very simply, FAR, fabrication and revisionism. And what unionism needs is truth and reality. We need to get the real truth out, but we're failing miserably to do that. And that is down to our politicians. And the politicians that we have put our trust in since 1998. And that's where, when I say I've got a feeling of hopelessness, I wish we could trust politicians. I certainly think that there are better people. I would like to say I'd like to see more young people in here today. I'd like to see more young people getting involved. And I'll cover that up. Malvinas is not an Argentine cause, it's a global cause because they are taking our fisheries and oil reserves. They put this out, it was all part of their strategy. Argentine regularly appeal to the UN and seek to multilateralise the dispute, and they require other nations in that area to publicly show support. They were seeking support from around the world, and the British government weren't challenging. They were challenging. So if you don't challenge something, if you don't challenge the lies, if you don't challenge it's what happened here in Northern Ireland today, you're actually aiding and abetting the lies and the strategy that's being used against you. And I've got into many arguments with politicians and other people about my way of thinking, but I stand by it. They adopted celebrities. They got celebrities, idiots, from Pink Floyd, that Agent Morrissey. Sean Penn apparently was sort of conned into it to support their cause. Again, we've seen that. We've seen Nesbitt down in. They know how to use celebrity to actually promote their cause, and it's all calculated. It's all part of a strategy that we don't see. We don't see. So what do? We slam Nesbitt, slam other people instead of developing our own. The Guardian, who would buy the Guardian, so we would never read it, but they put advertisements in the Guardian. They paid for articles, open letters to the Prime Minister. Anyway, this was all again part of their strategy. And the picture on the left, the guy standing there in the street, he was an Argentine, Fernando Zeilberg. He was an Argentine athlete who was going to compete at the London Olympics, did compete at the London Olympics. Argentines can go to the Falklands, there's no ban on them. So this guy went to the Falklands, went with a secret film crew, and you can see the time of the night that it was taken. There's nobody about, there's no cars in the running again. And they'd done a video of him training on the Falkland Islands. But when they put that out, because the Olympics were in London, what they put out was that this was an Argentine athlete training on Argentine soil to compete on British soil. And that went out on YouTube and everywhere. And again, it was part of their clever narrative. So what the Falklands done, they took they brought in the Royal Holloway University experts, tremendous people. I spoke to one for a long time. We can learn so much from talking to people like that. And they took it on themselves. They knew they couldn't rely on the British government to represent their case around the world. And they took it on. And I've put this up, because it nearly went over my head, but strategic narratives are representations of a sequence of events and identities, a commutative tool through which political actors, usually elites, attempt to give determined meaning to past, present and future in order to achieve political objectives. Critically, strategic narratives integrate interests and goals. They articulate end states and suggest how to get there. So when you see all these All-Ireland forums and whatnot coming up, and you start grouping it together, what republicanism is actually doing, and what we do to counter it, it's little wonder they're way ahead in their thinking, way ahead in their thinking. I had a long conversation with this guy. I told Mark to go home half 8, it was after midnight by the time I spoke to him for a few hours. One of these educated elites. But there were so many parallels when I was talking to him, because he understood Northern Ireland, believe me, and so many parallels to what Sinn Féin do today, and what we failed to do, and then what the Argentinians did, what the Falkland Islanders did to counter the Argentines. And it was very simple. It was our islands, our home. The Argentines had always said that the Falkland Islanders had no right to be there. They were like us, like Republicans. What they say of us, we're planters. They've no right to be here. That was the Argentine strategic narrative, that the Falkland Islanders had no right to be there. There has never been indigenous people in the Falkland Islands. Never. Argentine had never had a population or people in the Falkland Islands. But the current Falkland Islanders can trace their back, not all of them, but the families, 9 generations. They've been there for several hundred years. They're the people that stayed there the longest. So they countered the narrative, and it became our islands, our home. And the Falkland Islands as home, self-determination. And this is where they've got great appreciation for the military, for veterans like us, who fought and gave them that self-determination, which they used. Self-representation by Falkland Islanders in regional global scale, and good governance and constitutional democracy. I'll not go into the whole thing, but they had a referendum. They knew they would win it. There was no ifs or buts. It was 99.7% to remain a British independency. But it was a hard thing for them to do. And it's an interesting fact in the right. 3,200 people, that's all there is in the Falklands. 60 nationalities from St. Helena and Chile and everywhere else. And they can trace their heritage back, as I say, it's their 9 generations. Over 200 years. But they used all that as a strength, that they were a tolerant people, that they welcomed people, that they were progressive. And they took on looking after the ecology. And that's why there's no oil being taken out. Had Britain had the Reds, probably been empty now. You know, but they didn't, because they put the ecology of the area first. They put everything that they were a responsible government. And they negated the Argentine, because the Argentines just want the oil. They negated the Argentine argument. And the bottom picture is at the United Nations. The Argentines have got eight, I think it is, MLAs. Call them MLAs, just like we do here, that form the government. They don't have any political parties. They are all independents. What a dream that would be. You'd have none of the political idiots that we've got. They have no political parties. And the reason for that, you get a political party, you create a clique, you create self-party interest and everything else. These people all work purely for the interest of Argentine. 5 of them are...
The Falklands.
The Falklands, sorry. That's why I bring her. They work in the interests of the Falkland Islanders. And there's 5 of them are from Stanley and 3 of them from what they call the camp, out in the sticks, down the country as we would call it. That is the camp in Argentine, or in the Falkland Islands. And 3 of the MLAs come from there. The bottom picture is actually, there was a United Nations conference on decolonisation. Decolonisation. The United Nations are looking at colonies around the world, so these colonies have their own self-determination. Are they still being influenced by outside governments to keep them under control and all the rest of it? Well, the Argentines had been speaking at the UN for many, many years, always addressing these things. Falkland Islanders had no representation. Britain wasn't representing them right. So they took it on themselves, and that's 2 of them, their MLAs. They're young islanders. A girl spoke 2 weeks ago when I went to a lecture. She's a 4th-year medical student at Queen's University from the Falkland Islands. And they've got people, because there's no universities there, so they come and they go to universities in America and UK, different places and different things. They become young ambassadors to the country. And listen to this girl who was a 4th-year medical student, her knowledge of the war. And there was a second one who was at a university in England, was there also. These youngsters can give you chapter and verse of that 40 years. They weren't born. They're 20, 25-year-old, that sort of age. They weren't born when the war happened, but they know that whole history, and they live. And this young girl who was a medical student at Queen's, right at the end she said, "We are Falkland Islanders, but we are British. We treasure our British identity," she said, "and it will never be the Malvinas. Never." And that's the strength that they're building in their young folk. I mean, we don't have anything like that. We don't have anything. So that's where I'm going to call it a day, really. For the comparators, how proud I was, and I spoke a little bit at the end of it from the audience, and said that it would be really heartening to listen to these people present the Falkland Islands today, 40 years on, where they are, how they have moved on, particularly in the last 10 years, when they were dependent on Britain for 30 years to represent them. They're still British, still fiercely British. The Falkland Island offices in Whitehall in London. Falkland Islanders were at every party conference for British unions. There's only 3,200 of them. We're a small nation, but they've really taken it upon themselves. And I looked at it, and they brought in, and they developed their own strategic narrative. And I thought, we don't have anything like that. We don't have anything. We're nearly powerless against the Sinn Féin machine that's being waged against us. And until unionism can do that, or can learn the lessons from other people and stop depending on themselves. I mean, what is the union strategy for every party? I'll tell you what it is: to win the next election, to fight against each other. That's as far as our strategy goes. There is no long-term strategy with any of them. And we need to start developing, if it isn't already too late. So that's me finished. I hope it didn't bore you too much.